After part 1 of our Lightroom Adjustment Brush tutorial, in this part 2 you will learn how to isolate on white, isolate on black, refine your mask by color, use density, flow and so much more. Before we start, make sure you watched part 1 of our Lightroom Adjustment Brush tutorial, because this part 2 takes a more advanced approach on this awesome Lightroom tool. Ready? Let's get started. On a trip I photographed these mangoes, but the background isn't perfectly white. If you place that on a magazine or on a website, that would look pretty ugly. Now let's see how we can improve that. You know that with a J key, I can hide or show over or underexposed areas. Here in red, that's the only part that's white, and white is overexposed. At least Lightroom thinks so, but if you're shooting on white, you want it to be white. With the overlay selected and the auto mask selected, because we don't want to paint over the greens, we're now going to paint over all the white areas in our image. Next, we hide the overlay and increase our whites so that we get an overexposure warning for the complete background. If I now hide the overexposure warning hitting the J key, I will see that we have a beautiful white background. What I don't like is that yellow color cast in the shadows, so we're going to get rid of that. Press New Brush, big brush size, reduce the saturation, and with the auto mask selected, maybe that's too big, we just paint over the shadow areas. And the color cast is gone. Did you like the content so far? Why not subscribe, put your thumbs up or leave a comment to keep me motivated producing more content. Would you have expected that you can even isolate on black in Lightroom? Let's reset the brush, create a new brush, reduce the exposure, highlights, shadows, whites and blacks all the way, and paint with the auto mask selected over your image. Now that gives me the opportunity to explain the auto mask tool a bit better. The most important thing with the auto mask tool is the center of the circle, in this case the plus. You must not cross the mango border here with this plus. As soon as you do, it will paint over it. But let me undo that. As long as you stay outside, you will have a beautiful, clean mask. Now let me quickly finish that. Okay, zoom in a bit. Time to use the Alt key again. And we're done. No, we're not. I see we have some arrows here. We need to remove that with the Alt key and of course the auto mask selected. And then again we paint over that area like that. We zoom out and with a big brush and a very low feather we're going to paint over the rest. Now we can uncheck the auto mask. Do you remember where that overexposed area was up here? Sometimes you can't get it right with one brush because you can't make it dark enough. So you make a new one with the same setting and just paint over it. One more thing I would like to do. The edges of the mango look a bit unnatural. That's because the white background acts as a reflector, but now we are shooting or we are seeing the mangoes on black. So I want to reduce the brightness of the edges a bit. I'm going to use a very big and soft brush. I'm going to reset the effects, the feather all the way up, and I'm going to make it really big, reduce the exposure a bit, and then I'll paint only with the feather area over the edges of the mangoes. You see? Looks much more realistic now. What I still don't like is the center area here. So I'm going to create a new brush. I'm going to reduce the exposure to -4 and paint here. I didn't have the auto mask selected. Now I'm going to press the Alt key, select the auto mask, and paint over the areas I don't want to be affected. And as I said with the castle, lift your mouse button every now and then. I think we're done. Let's zoom out. It's not perfect. If we had a little more time, we could make it even better, but I think you get the idea, so we can move on to the next image. This image looks pretty okay, but let me reset the brush. What happened? If you use polarizer filter with very wide lenses, you get a gradient in the sky. The good news is you can get rid of that in Lightroom, and I'm going to show you how. Let's reset our brush. And I'm going to paint with a very, very big brush over this area. Then I'm going to lift the exposure, lift the shadows a bit, and lower the highlights to even it out a bit. It does look better already, but it's nowhere near perfect. We have the very dark area here, we have a bright area, and then it gets darker again. So we need to remove a part of the brush we just painted. And we're going to reduce the flow quite a bit to around, let's say 25. And then we're going to paint over this area, click, 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 and there, click, 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 click. The reduced flow is the key to this method. It's much better already. I'm going to create a new brush. I'm going to reduce the flow here too, and lift the exposure again here. And then I'm going to paint again over this area. Click, click, click. Make a smaller brush. Click, click. And in time, I'm getting there. It's a question of patience. Now let's create a new brush. I'm reducing the exposure a bit. Still the flow is very low, and I paint in these brighter areas, like so, and so, like here. And you see we're slowly getting there. Let's have a look at the before and after. It's still a bit blotchy here, so I'm going to paint a bit more here and there. But now I think it's fine. Before, after. Now let me use this image to explain the flow and the density of the brush. But because the brush used the way I did it right now makes Lightroom pretty laggy, I'm going to reset the brush for the moment. Now what are flow and density all about? Let me use a new brush, the exposure all the way down. I'm going to use no feather. The flow will be 100 and the density 2. And I'm going to paint here. You will see immediately one click will make the circle black. Now what if I reduce the flow to, let's say, 25%. Then we create a new brush and click once beside the old one. What do we see? Clicking once will paint the settings at 25% opacity. That's the 25 here. If we click more than once or keep the mouse button pressed, we will eventually reach the 100%, like here. So much for the flow. Now what about the density? Let's create another brush, put the flow up to 100% and put the density down to 25, like that. And then we're going to paint here again. You will now probably ask yourself, but what's the difference to the flow? The difference is I can paint as long as I want and I will never exceed the threshold of 25%. So the density is the maximum opacity you can achieve no matter how long you paint, while the flow just reduces the speed at which the settings are painted onto your image. Imagine the flow being a spray paint with color. Now let's make a new brush, density all the way up, the flow somewhere near 50, and paint over your image. If you have a spray paint with color, the longer you stay on a spot, the denser your color will get. And that's the same with the flow. I hope that was clear enough. Let's continue to our next image. Another example that you cannot always get it right in camera. Let's reset the brush, and there you go. The bright areas are well exposed, the rest is underexposed. I could have used a flash, but I was on a trip and didn't have one with me. So let's quickly correct that image. I'm going to use a big brush with a big feather and lift the exposure quite a bit. Paint over the area. I'm going to increase the flow to 100% and I'm going to paint over this area. Looks pretty nice already. Maybe lift the exposure up a tiny bit more. What I don't like is the transition between the brighter areas and the darker areas. So I'm going to work on that. And that's where flow comes in very handy. I'm going to use a smaller brush, set the flow to, let's say, somewhere there, 35%, and new brush, of course, and reduce the exposure a bit and paint in this area. Oh, I lifted the exposure, sorry, I'll reduce the exposure. And painting here, there. Okay, and then I'll make another new brush. And this time I'm lifting the exposure and I'm painting in this area. So getting better already. Looks pretty nice. I think we're done. You think you already learned some cool things? Hold your breath, it gets even better. Now I'm going to teach you how to refine your selection by color. What happens pretty often, especially when photographing couples, is that they don't have matching skin tones. And I'm not talking about racial differences. It's, for example, when the man had a hard laugh or has a sunburn. Let me remove the brush here. Like that. Then he has a more magenta skin tone than his wife. Now what can we do? Let me introduce you to the range mask. I'm going to create a new brush. Exposure all the way down to see the mask. Size is good. Flow, let's take 100%. Big brush and paint over his face, like that. And now I'm going to select range mask color down here. I'm going to select the eyedropper tool and choose a color from his forehead. We already get a pretty refined mask here, but we can fine tune it even more by dragging the amount slider down here. Okay, let's work with that mask. I'm going to reset the exposure. Reduce the tint to the greens, like that, and maybe rise the temp a bit and reduce the saturation, like so. You see, the skin tones already match pretty well. Let's see the before and the after. Okay, let's find another use for the range mask. This image, we shot it at ISO 6400 for our noise comparison video. You sure know that noise is most visible in darker uniform areas like in our background here. Let me zoom in. I hope you see this well enough in the YouTube video. We want to get rid of the noise in the background, but we don't want to touch the details in the flowers. So we're looking for a method to select the background only, and that is the range mask. So let's zoom out again and take a big brush, paint over the background roughly like so. Now I'm going to select range mask again, color, and pick a color here. You see, A part is already selected, but not everything. I can shift click another color, and another color, and another color, and another color. But 5 is a maximum. As soon as I click one more time, 1 will be gone. But there is a better method than clicking 5 times. Let's undo that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And click and drag a square with your mouse. Like that. And now I can fine tune with the amount again. Like that. Maybe that was too much. The edges are a little rough. And now let's work on the settings. I'll reset the exposure and I will increase the noise reduction. And now let's zoom in. Make sure you see that. I'm going to reduce the noise reduction and increase it again. There is a big difference. I could also reduce the sharpness like that. So with a pretty quick and dirty trick, I got rid of most of the noise in the background. Let's zoom out again. That's it. Let's make one final image in this adjustment brush chapter. If I reset the adjustment brush, you're going to see it wasn't all that great to begin with. So now let's reconstruct that. When photographing indoors, it is often good to wait for the evening because otherwise your windows will be blown out unless you use a flash. Which you don't want to because you want the room lights to pop and not the flash. But the problem is the indoor lights are much warmer than the light outside in the evening. That's pretty blue. So we need to adjust the windows. We're going to use a pretty big brush and brush over the image, also over the table, with an exposure of -4. Next, I'm going to zoom in, like so. Choose Range Mask Color, take the eyedropper and drag a selection here. Zoom out, and you see we have a pretty good selection. But as you know by now, we can even fine-tune that with the amount slider. Like so. Looks pretty cool. Now we can lift the exposure quite a bit. Lift the temperature slider. Then, of course, reduce the highlights. Lift the shadows for the curtains, like that. And maybe lift the temperature even more. Like that. Looks pretty cool. But we have another window back here, so I'm going to zoom in all the way. This time I'm going to choose a very low feather, big brush, and paint over this area. And here. And now I'm going to press the Alt key with the auto mask selected. I'm going to paint away the areas that were too rough painted. Okay, that was fast forward. Now we're going to lift the exposure again. Of course, we lift the temperature all the way up, the highlights down, the shadows up, like so. And we see even though the temperature is at 100, we still have some blue in the windows. So what can we do? Before we do anything though, I see there is some spill on the top of the window and on the bottom. We don't want that. So let's display the mask overlay again and refine that. Okay, we're done refining. Overlay again, and now we can duplicate this brush, like so. We reset the effect and only lift the temperature. As always, I could fine-tune this a bit more, but it should work for now. Let's zoom out. And what I see, this area is a bit dark, So I take a new brush, paint over this area, reset the exposure and lift the exposure a tad bit. And I think we're done. We went from here all the way to there, only using the adjustment brush. So much for the Lightroom Adjustment Brush. Next up are other Lightroom local adjustments like the radial filter or the graduated filter. From here onwards it will get easier. Promised. If this video was helpful for you, please help us rank higher in YouTube searches by subscribing, leaving a comment or simply spreading the word.